We'll start this week with some Premier League reaction. Both Mark and James, you were at the Emirates for Arsenal against Spurs. James, I'll start with you as our North London man. Was it a case of Arsenal were fantastic or Spurs below the level that you would expect in a North London derby?
Well, it was a little bit of both, really. I know we'll come on to talk about Spurs later on. They were quite passive. They were very defensive. They sort of set up a little bit like, a sort of lower table, mid-table team against a team going for the Premier League title, and then it's up, of course, to the home side to break them down. And that habitually, last season was a game that caused Arsenal quite a lot of problems. And I've said it sort of on this podcast before, but if Arsenal started to click in an attacking sense, then they are going to win the league, because what the question we'd only really seen to this point, the only one they hadn't answered, was can they score consistently from open play? Can they create and break teams down? Or are they sort of reliant on those set pieces and keeping clean sheets week after week? And I think it was such a powerful performance from an Arsenal team bereft of probably 2 or 3 of their starting 11 if everybody was fit. And the fact that Eberechi Eze was the man who made the difference is obviously the narrative around the fact that he almost joined Spurs. But, he probably doesn't play if everybody's fit. And yet he scores a hat-trick in the North London derby, the first one in that fixture for 47 years. And Arsenal are 6 points clear at the top. So, it's really, really ominous, I think, for the rest of the league, that if Arsenal are starting to click, and they're starting to do it without really the one player who tends to stitch it all together, and that's Martin Odegaard, then when they get everyone back, you just cannot see at the moment anybody else having the consistency to stop them. But I remind myself that Arsenal have had these kind of leads before, much later in the season, and it's only November, but I mean, they are just clear favourites to win the title now.
Mark, did you get the sense that you were watching the champions or champions-elect, so to speak?
Yeah, this feels like the Liverpool season, the first time they went on the clock. They just, Arsenal look and seem head and shoulders above everybody else for very different reasons. Obviously the coaches seems to finally got it together now in terms of Arteta, but like James mentioned the injuries, and just looking at the players that were absent through injury yesterday, obviously Gabriel, Odegaard, Havertz, Kai Havertz has barely played, Gyökeres, Gabriel Jesus. I mean, that's a pretty strong 5-a-side team, to be honest, but you got your best centre-half, you got your captain in midfield, you got your big money centre-forward, and you got Kai Havertz. I mean, that is basically the spine of the team gone, and they still hammered their local rivals 4-1, and I think, they'll go to Chelsea next Sunday with a 6-point lead. Now, I fully expect Arsenal to win that again quite comfortably, so they could be 9 points lead next week if results continue to go their way. So they just look really strong. I mean, they're not the Arsenal of Arsene Wenger, no, the Invincibles that are tearing teams apart with their flair and their style. They're a different team. They weren't the George Graham team of the early 90s. It's power, it's strength, but it's every part of the team is really strong. And, Tottenham yesterday were kind of blown away. I mean, they had 2 touches in the Arsenal penalty in the first half and 2 in the second half. So that shows you how poor Tottenham were. But that was because Arsenal was so strong. Back to your original question, Arsenal were really strong. And I think that made Tottenham weaker. But Tottenham are a good team anyway, especially with people like Maddison and Kulusevski and Solanke missing. But Arsenal, for me, they'll win the title with ease. And despite the fact they've stumbled at the final furlong a couple of times, I just don't think anybody's in a decent shape to challenge them this season.
James, obviously it was Eze with the headline performance. Just from the stories that you were writing over the summer, how close was he to joining Spurs? I mean, was he on the verge of joining Spurs before Arsenal swooped in? And are you surprised at all at the impact that he's been able to have in quite a short space of time at the Emirates?
Yeah, I mean, he was very close to joining Tottenham. I mean, he was one phone call away from joining Tottenham, and that phone call was the one that Eze made to Mikel Arteta to say, I've read that you're interested. Are you going to make a move to sign me? And it was such a sliding doors moment, because I remember actually Arsenal were holding an open training session that only a handful of journalists went to watch at the Emirates, which I was one. And, you sort of do that, as we all do, when you go and watch these things, you sort of count the players and you see who's there and who's not. We noticed Kai Havertz wasn't there, and sort of just mentioned it to a couple of the club officials who just said, oh no, it's gym work. I think they said, I was following a different individual training program or whatever. Of course, it turns out he had a serious, hamstring injury, and they weren't entirely being upfront with the severity of it, although I suppose they'd argue they didn't quite know how bad it was at the time, but clearly they would have known straight away it was something serious. And it was that Havertz injury that convinced Arsenal to go back into the market. They'd looked to Eze, they considered that, and they felt as though they had enough with Havertz being fit. But then, of course, that injury happens, and they know that Eze, as a lifelong Arsenal fan, would love to come to the club. They also obviously have seen his quality. One of the standout players for Palace, scored the win in the FA Cup final. All of those things. They were, they'd done the due diligence, the background. He was firmly on their radar, but they weren't going to make that move until that Havertz injury. And Eze, of course, in the middle of all of this, was on the brink of joining Tottenham and just thought it was worth a phone call to the Arsenal manager to see if there was interest in his dream move. And they decided to go for it. And things moved very quickly from that point. Obviously, Spurs had agreed the fee and the structure of a deal, so Arsenal could essentially match that. There wasn't really any need for any negotiation. The player terms weren't a problem. So it all moved very, very fast once that phone call was made and the club had decided to act. But yeah, I mean, look, I mean, whenever Arteta's talked about Eze, he sort of said, "Oh, there's a lot more to come from him," and we've not necessarily seen the best of him yet. And he's had a couple of key contributions. He scored against Palace actually already this season, and he's been influential at times, but he's also been quiet in matches. And I think from the way that they were talking yesterday, I think they see that game against Tottenham as a real landmark moment that he can step up and kick on from there and become maybe now part of that regular starting 11. It's hard to see where he fits in, because your 2-8s are going to be Declan Rice and Martin Odegaard probably every day of the week. Zubimendi's been one of the standout signings as the 6, and that's your midfield 3. Eze could play out on the left, but Leandro Trossard's been doing very well out there. They've obviously got Martinelli. They've got various options out there as well. Nwaneri can play out there. So it's hard to sort of see exactly where he fits in, but at the moment you kind of can't drop him. And the key thing really is that his contribution is another example of how they don't have to rush players back, which is something that Arsenal were guilty of doing in the past. And Odegaard would probably have played in that North London derby last season had they not had an Eze who could come in. And it means that Odegaard's just had another few days to get himself right and just make sure that when he does come back, he doesn't break down again in another week or 2 weeks' time. So, yes, there's more to come from him, but it's just symptomatic of the business that they did in the summer, strengthening that squad so much that a little goes a long way from each player in that sense.
James, just actually, you mentioned the Eze situation then, and where he fits in when everyone's fit. But are we seeing enough from Saka at the moment? 3 goals and no assists all season. I don't think he was great against Tottenham. And I guess if Saka has a dip or gets injured, then Eze can play on that side where Saka plays. And are we kind of giving Saka a bit of a pass here, or does he need to kind of do more to kind of raise himself to the standards he's shown before?
Yeah, I mean, he has been a little bit quiet, but there's always so much focus on him. There's this, I think when Odegaard's not in the team, Saka does struggle a little bit more. I always remember Thomas Tuchel when he was Bayern manager, just before Bayern played Arsenal a couple of years ago and knocked him out of the Champions League. He basically broke down exactly how Arsenal played. And he said, they go down the right-hand side with Ben White or Jurriën Timber and Odegaard and Saka, and they create overloads on that right-hand side, and that's how they become dangerous. So when, obviously, Odegaard's not in the team, it creates a different dynamic, and you just see that Saka's maybe not getting the ball quite as early as he would like. He's not able to take players on quite as much as he would like. But I don't think there's been a massive drop-off. But this is a guy who is one of the best players in the Premier League, is in the middle of contract negotiations to become one of the best paid players in the Premier League, and is somebody who's quite openly talked about wanting to win the Ballon d'Or one day, wanting to sort of, be in that conversation with the Vinicius Juniors, the Lamine Lamars, the very, very best sort of wingers in the world at the moment. And so I guess against that standard, he's not quite hitting his mark. But, what does it say about this Arsenal squad that they haven't needed Saka to be at his absolute best, and yet they're 6 points clear at the top of the table? Again, last season, they wouldn't have been anywhere near this. They would have needed Saka to be delivering every game. But I think it's part of the sort of diversification of threat, if you like, that Mikel Arteta wants. He wants threat from every angles and not just going through one part of the pitch. So maybe that's a sort of rebalancing that Saka's had to adapt to.
Rob, are we kind of guilty? I mean, I put my hands up. I said that Arsenal win the title quite easily, but are we kind of giving it to them on a plate right now? Do you think City could mount a challenge? Or do you think, even Liverpool, if they can get their act together? I know they're double digits behind now, but are we kind of just saying, going a little bit early with Arsenal, it's only November? Do you think that they are going to win it, or are we talking about, it being a coronation?
Well, it's funny, I was just about to ask you the same question there, that is there a way that Arsenal don't win the league? And in my mind, they have got the strongest squad. You've got James there talking about Eze, who scored a hat-trick in a North London derby, who wouldn't necessarily start a game if everyone's fit, which clearly points to the strength of their squad. The one question mark I would have around Arsenal is the mentality, and whether it turns into a race after Christmas, whether they are mentally prepared or able to get over the line. Now, the one thing that you can say about Pep Guardiola's City is that when they get into a race, if there is a title race, they tend to win it. The times that they haven't won the title is when there hasn't been a race at all. There's been a team that's just streaked clear, and City have been nowhere. My concern with Arsenal would be that if it gets tight in, say, February, March, like we saw it in 2023, have Arsenal got the nous to stay in that race and to get over the line? And that's a question that you can't answer until they do it, because until they do it, it's always a question that will be levelled at them, because they've gone close a couple of times and haven't managed to get their hands on the trophy. They're only going to answer it if they actually end up lifting the title. So it's difficult. I think the only way that they don't win it from here is if they get in their own way. If obviously you can't predict whether there's going to be injuries. There could be an awful lot of injuries to one area of the squad, and you can't compensate for that. But I think that if the season runs as we expect it to, the only way that Arsenal don't win it is if they start to crack under the pressure a little bit. And it would have been interesting to see what would have happened this weekend. Say if City had beaten Newcastle, because obviously, Arsenal have come off a draw with Sunderland. City have then gone and beaten Liverpool. The momentum seems to be swinging towards City a little bit, and then all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, City lose to Newcastle. Arsenal put in this statement performance against Tottenham, and the momentum is back with Arsenal. It would be interesting to see how Arsenal would have coped with it if that momentum swing towards City would have carried on, closer to Christmas and across New Year. And it will be interesting to see if that happens in New Year.
We're just talking for the books, because I think that as good as Arsenal have been, this is probably the weakest Premier League for ages. I can't think of a title race where the second best team is so far. Well, there's nobody impressive. I mean, Arsenal have been impressive because they're so organised, so well drilled. They're not great to watch at times, but Man City aren't great. Liverpool have been terrible. Chelsea, the second right now, but Chelsea aren't going to finish second, I don't think. Even Man United have got a chance to the top four. This for me is the worst chasing pack. Probably, I can't think. Well, they probably when Leicester won it. This is not a very strong Premier League. And Arsenal, if they don't win it this year, they'll never win it, because this is the best chance they've got, because they are so strong at the time when everyone else is so weak.
Yeah, two things have happened here. Arsenal have got a little bit better and certainly stronger in terms of the depth of their squad. But there's no doubt that the rivals are weaker than they've been in the last couple of years. Obviously, Liverpool have fallen off the cliff in the last few weeks. City, you still think City are the one team that could go and put 10, 12 wins together consecutively and maybe get themselves to a point where they're within touching distance. And I agree with Rob completely that, the mentality is the one thing. We did see it when they got into a toe-to-toe scrap with City, that the performances did suffer a little bit from, there was certainly fatigue in the squad, but also just the pressure, you could see it got to them a little bit. But the concern for the rest of the league is they might be so far ahead by March or April that it won't matter. I find myself, it's funny because I went on tour with Arsenal in pre-season, and they were very bullish on tour behind the scenes. They felt they'd really nailed the transfer market, and that was before they'd signed Eze. They really felt they'd got everything that they wanted. Mikel Arteta was a really relaxed, confident sort of figure on tour. I think he knew he'd sorted out a lot of the deficiencies in that squad. I sort of found myself not wanting to be overly influenced by that in my pre-season prediction, so I didn't go for them to win the league, because you don't want to feel like you're drinking the Kool-Aid too much, But it's only the mentality factor, and sort of I wonder whether actually, Rob, because I wanted to ask you about this, whether Pep Guardiola was starting to try and play that game a little bit with what he was saying before the Newcastle game, when he sort of said the season starts now. It felt to me as much of that was a message, I thought, to Arsenal and to Mikel Arteta. And we know they're great friends, but still, they're obviously competitors going for the league. Did you feel that was a little bit of a message, perhaps to his own squad as well? And then if so, how much of a disappointment was it that they then go and lose the first game after he says the season starts now at Newcastle?
Yeah, I mean, he's had a couple of little sort of nibbles at it. He said before the Liverpool game, I think he said, you can't win the title in November, which seems obvious, but, you know, the inference was that everyone's raving about Arsenal, but they've not won anything yet. And then he has another sort of go before the Newcastle game. You know, the season starts here. It's almost like laying down the gauntlet to Arsenal, saying, now comes the hard work. But obviously City didn't, you know, hold up their end of the bargain. They needed to go to Newcastle and win that game. And as I said before, it's a weekend where the momentum again has just shifted towards Arsenal. And it will be interesting to see what happens next weekend, because obviously Arsenal go to Chelsea, which has become top versus second, and City have got a home game against Leeds. Now, you would expect City to win that game, and obviously Arsenal's game is tougher. So it's a weekend either that Arsenal really put the foot down and show everyone that they really are destined to win this title, or they don't win that game, City win theirs, and the momentum shifts. Maybe not very much, but it does shift back towards City. So I don't think we can really make any proper predictions until sort of February, March. And the one thing I would say about Pep, and he has mentioned this a couple of times before, that when Arsenal were close a couple of years ago, they had 50 odd points after 19 games, and Pep referenced it again and again and again. And in that season, City was still able to put a run together and chase Arsenal down. Now, you're right in what you say, James. This isn't the same Arsenal team. It's also not the same City team. But you'd have to think that will stick in some people's minds at Arsenal, saying that we had this almost perfect first half of the season a couple of years ago and still weren't able to get over the line until you actually get your hands on the trophy. That's the only way that you can answer that question of whether you're mentally able to do it.
Listen, we have to talk about the other team that's involved in the North London derby at the weekend. It was a two-team game, and it was obviously Tottenham were hammered 4-1. A lot of talk about Thomas Frank being under pressure, which seems ridiculous, but they have got 3 pretty big games coming up in the league after PSG away, which is a terrible, daunting trip on Wednesday. So Fulham at home, Newcastle away, then Brentford at home. Are we going to talk about Thomas Frank being in difficulty by the time he gets to the Brentford game, or is this just a ridiculous early season knee-jerk reaction?
Look, I mean, you'd normally say with the sort of natural life of these things that no, he wouldn't be under pressure, but it's the fans that are going to put him under pressure. And we talked before about, I mean, you know, Mark, we were at, you know, a game not that long ago, just, you know, the United game, where you could hear it then that Thomas Frank was coming under pressure. And you sort of think, well, this is kind of crazy that the manager who's obviously been brought in to take this club from a very difficult place, yes, as Europa League winners, but they finished 17th last season with an imbalanced squad, with an imperfect transfer window, and who had actually started pretty well, certainly from a defensive point of view, is suddenly finding himself having his substitutions booed and the style questions and whether he's up to the job. For me, I find it, you know, there's often a lot of talk, you know, the media, the papers, whoever are putting a manager under undue pressure early on. This is coming from the supporters, I think, more than anyone else. And there is a degree of frustration towards him. I thought the way they set up at Arsenal was like, you know, a sort of League One side, a Championship side, going to a Premier League side in the FA Cup, trying to keep it tight and nicking a goal on the break or through a set piece. That's not good enough if you're Tottenham. You could argue it's good enough if you're Brentford, but it's not if you're Tottenham in the North London derby. Yes, you could argue, again, that physicality, trying to match Arsenal's physicality might well be the way to beat them, actually. And I think there's a lot of sense and pragmatism in the way that he set his team up. But the problem is that the only thing that matters then is the result. If you do not get a positive result, there is nothing else to recommend you, because you've sent a really negative message at the start of the game. You're not going to be playing good football, really. I mean, he left most of his technicians on the bench. He had Xavi Simons, Lucas Bergvall, Archie Gray playing midfield, Brendan Johnson, all these kind of more sort of creative, sort of guile players were not in the team. He'd chosen Richarlison up front instead of Randall Kolo-Muani, again for his defensive ability from set pieces. And you sort of think, okay, with Kevin Danso going in for the long throws and the three centre backs, you could see the argument for it. but it A, it didn't work, and B, when he tried to open it up at the start of the second half, they conceded within whatever it was, 40 seconds. So, he got his game plan wrong, as much as he sort of suggested that there was a lack of aggression in the team and they didn't win their duels and perhaps sort of questioning the mentality of the players a little bit. And there probably was a bit of that, but he just got the lineup wrong. He got that team selection wrong. And the more he does that in those big games and almost concedes the initiative, it just reinforces the idea that some Spurs fans already have, that he doesn't have the scope and the pedigree to be able to turn Spurs into a possession-based dominant team, an attacking dynamic side that people want to see. And, and we've said on this podcast before, it's easy to set up a team defensively. That's the easy bit. The hard bit is getting them to attack and creating problems for opponents. And I have a degree of sympathy with Thomas Frank because, of course, as we've already talked about, they missed out on Eze, they missed out on Morgan Gibbs-White, they got Xavi Simons and Randall Kolomuani right at the end of the window. Kolomuani's obviously been injured for a few weeks as well. As you've mentioned, Mark, he's missing Solanke, he's missing Kulusevski, he's missing Maddison. So there's a lot of moving parts that create a problem for Thomas Frank. But he's starting to have quite a few weeks to be able to grapple with this and to come up with some sort of solution. And he's not, I'm not a great fan of XG, but their XG against Arsenal was terrible. They've now recorded the 2 lowest expected goals tallies of any Premier League team this season. And both of those tallies have come in big games against Chelsea and then against Arsenal. And that's not where you want to be against what are supposed to be top 4 rivals. So it does need to improve, and it needs to improve quickly.